The Zarthans had arrived. Their ships, vast and imposing, cast shadows over Earth's major cities. The people of Earth looked up in awe, and fear rippled across the globe. These weren't just any aliens. The Zarthans were the galaxy's undisputed conquerors, physically unstoppable, technologically advanced, and with a brutal philosophy that celebrated war as the ultimate test of a species' worth. From the moment their fleet entered Earth's orbit, the world held its breath. Their leader, Warlord Threx, addressed humanity in a booming voice that echoed across frequencies, penetrating every screen, every device. Humans, we are the Zarthans, the strongest species in the galaxy. We demand war. Prove your strength, or be wiped from existence. There was no negotiation in Threx's tone, only a cold certainty that the fate of Earth hung in the balance. His demand wasn't just about territorial conquest, it was a challenge of pride. The Zarthans valued war above all else. In their culture, it was the ultimate display of strength. To refuse meant immediate destruction. To lose meant extinction. Earth had no precedent for such a situation. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a simple and devastating choice: fight or perish. Global panic set in. News stations filled with analysts predicting humanity's doom. Militaries across the world scrambled, knowing that their combined forces were a speck compared to the might of the Zarathian war machine. Earth's leaders gathered in emergency sessions. The UN's chambers, usually filled with bureaucratic bickering, were now suffused with the stark realization that humanity was on the brink of annihilation. It was clear, humanity, as it stood, could not hope to match the Zarthans in a direct confrontation. The might of the invaders' technology, and the sheer power of their soldiers were beyond anything Earth had ever faced. The strongest military minds admitted it. Any traditional response would be futile. A sense of hopelessness began to take root. Then, in a quiet, almost absurd suggestion, someone within the Human Council proposed something that shifted the course of this crisis. It wasn't a general or a politician, it was a historian. "What if," the historian said, "we didn't give them the war they wanted? What if, instead, we gave them a history lesson?" The room, initially tense, grew silent. Some scoffed at the idea. A history lesson? Against the strongest species in the galaxy? Yet, as the historian continued, a new perspective emerged. "We can't outfight them, not on their terms. But what if we show them that our strength isn't just in combat? What if we show them that true power lies in our history, in our endurance, in our survival against all odds?" This was humanity's pivot. Instead of preparing for a battle they were destined to lose, they would present their story, a story of resilience, of thousands of years of conflict, of destruction and rebirth. And so, Earth's leaders, after deliberating the absurdity and brilliance of this plan, agreed. A message was sent back to the Zarathian fleet. It wasn't a declaration of war. Instead, the communication opened with a simple statement: "We will give you what you seek. But not in the way you expect." Threx, seated in his warship, raised an eyebrow at the response. This was not the typical reaction he received from countless other civilizations. Usually, they scrambled to gather their forces, offering pitiful defenses before being crushed under the Zarathian might. Or they begged for mercy, which Threx never gave. But this? A history lesson? He was intrigued, albeit mildly irritated. "Proceed," he commanded, settling into his seat, ready to witness what he expected would be a desperate attempt by a weak species to stall their inevitable destruction. And so, the broadcast began. It wasn't an appeal for peace. There were no cries of surrender. Instead, the message to the Zarthans was one of defiance, but not the kind they were accustomed to. It was the defiance of a species that had faced countless challenges, and yet, had endured. The humans were offering their history, not as a plea for mercy, but as a demonstration of strength. From the earliest days of recorded history, the message began. Humanity's voice, calm and composed, spoke of ancient civilizations, of wars that shaped the world. "We are a species born into conflict," the message said. "From the beginning, we have fought, not just against each other, but against the elements, against disease, against the universe itself. We have known war, and we have learned from it. Threx, watching with mild amusement, leaned back. To him, these were the words of a species trying to talk its way out of a fight. But as the message continued, something began to shift. The humans were not just recounting battles, they were telling the story of survival. They spoke of the wars that had torn continents apart, but also of how they had rebuilt, stronger each time. From the ashes of every great conflict, humanity had risen again. They detailed the lessons learned from each war, how empires had fallen due to arrogance, how the lust for power had often led to destruction. And yet, through it all, they had endured. We are not here to show you our weapons, the message continued, because our greatest strength lies not in the tools of war, but in our capacity to survive, to rebuild, and to grow. Threx's amusement faded. He had expected bravado, perhaps some feeble attempt to display military might. Instead, what he received was something far more profound. The humans were presenting war not as their greatest strength, but as a test they had passed, time and again. They were not seeking to engage in combat to prove their worth. They had already proven it, to themselves, through their history. The broadcast ended with a chilling final statement. We have survived everything our world, our history, and our own mistakes have thrown at us. We do not seek war. But do not mistake that for weakness. We are still here. And we will continue to be here. For the first time in a long time, Threx felt something he wasn't used to: doubt. The message from humanity had begun with ancient wars. The Zarthans listened as the humans recounted their early conflicts, the ones that shaped entire civilizations but also led to catastrophic destruction. The voice spoke of the Persian Wars, where the ancient Greeks, outnumbered and facing annihilation, had managed to repel the most powerful empire of their time. But this wasn't a boastful tale of victory. No, the humans emphasized the cost of those battles, the thousands who perished, the cities that were razed, the lives forever altered. The lesson was simple: war had defined humanity, but it had also ravaged it. Next came the Roman Empire, which grew from a small city-state into one of the most dominant forces in ancient history. The narrator described how the Romans, through sheer military might and strategic brilliance, had conquered vast territories. Yet, it wasn't the glory of Rome's expansion that the humans highlighted. It was the downfall. They spoke of how the very greed and overreach that made Rome great eventually led to its collapse. The humans had learned that no empire, no matter how powerful, could sustain itself through war alone. Warlord Threx listened, his initial boredom giving way to intrigue. The Zarthans had conquered and destroyed countless worlds, but none had ever presented their history this way. No species had ever admitted the weakness in their own pursuit of war. To the Zarthans, war was the ultimate expression of strength, a pure and noble pursuit. Yet here were the humans, showing how war had nearly undone them time and time again. As the story of human conflict continued, the voice turned to one of humanity's darkest hours: the World Wars. Threx's attention sharpened as the humans detailed the scale of these conflicts. Entire nations had been consumed by battle, millions had died, and whole cities had been reduced to rubble. The narrator spoke not of glory, but of horror. They described the trenches of World War I, where soldiers lived in squalor, facing death every day for inches of ground that held little strategic value. They painted a vivid picture of World War II, a conflict so vast that it spanned every continent, involving every major power of the time. The voice didn't stop at the battles. It moved on to the consequences. Hiroshima and Nagasaki ***, the first and only use of nuclear weapons in warfare. For the Zarthans, who prided themselves on their advanced technology and destructive capabilities, the use of such weapons might have seemed like a display of ultimate power. But the humans didn't present it that way. Instead, they spoke of the devastation: cities obliterated in an instant, tens of thousands of civilians killed in the blink of an eye, and the lingering effects of radiation that still haunted those lands generations later. Threx found himself unsettled. This wasn't the type of story he was used to hearing. The humans weren't glorifying their wars, they were condemning them. And yet, there was a strange strength in their words. The humans weren't afraid to confront the darkest parts of their history. They laid bare the truth of what war had cost them, and in doing so, they revealed a resilience that Threx hadn't expected. The voice continued, moving into the Cold War, a period of immense tension between the world's two superpowers, where the threat of mutual destruction hung over the entire planet. Threx learned that humanity had come perilously close to annihilation multiple times, not from alien invaders or external threats, but from their own hands. The humans spoke of how they had developed nuclear arsenals large enough to destroy the world many times over, and yet, somehow, they had managed to avoid using them. They had learned restraint. They had learned the value of diplomacy, of strategy, of thinking beyond immediate conquest. This was a new kind of strength. The humans, despite their history of conflict, had managed to step back from the brink of total destruction. They had learned to live with the tension, to navigate it, and in doing so, they had survived. The narrator didn't shy away from humanity's more recent conflicts. They spoke of the ongoing wars in the Middle East, the rise of terrorism, and the constant battles over ideology, resources, and power. Yet, through it all, the humans had continued to endure. The voice acknowledged that humanity was far from perfect. War was still a part of their world, but it no longer defined them as it once had. The message became clear: humans had fought wars, but they had also learned from them. They had evolved. Each conflict, each moment of destruction, had taught them something new, about themselves, about their limits, and about the value of peace. It wasn't that humans had grown weak. Far from it. They had learned that true strength didn't lie in the ability to wage war, but in the ability to avoid it. To survive, adapt, and move forward despite the scars of their past. Warlord Threx, a being who had known nothing but conquest his entire life, felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation creeping over him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to it. The humans had faced extinction multiple times. They had waged wars so massive in scale that even the Zarthans, for all their power, couldn't quite comprehend the devastation. And yet they had survived. The humans weren't offering war as a test of strength. They were offering their history as proof of their resilience. They had fought battles on a scale that dwarfed anything the Zarthans had ever experienced. But they had also chosen a different path, one that valued survival and growth over endless conquest. The voice concluded, "We have learned that war is not the path to greatness. It is merely a test of endurance, of survival. We have passed that test, and we have learned to seek peace. But make no mistake, we are still here. And we will continue to be here, long after the ashes of war have settled." Threx, for the first time in a long while, sat in silence. The humans hadn't just given him a lesson in history. They had given him something far more unsettling. They had shown him that their strength wasn't in their weapons or their armies. It was in their ability to learn, to adapt, and to survive even the worst of themselves. For the first time, Threx wondered if perhaps the Zarthans had underestimated this fragile species. Warlord Threx sat in deep thought. The message from humanity, this unexpected and unconventional response, was gnawing at him. He had expected bluster, bravado, or perhaps desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, what he had received was a chronicle of survival, a recounting of scars both inflicted and endured. This was not weakness, but something far more complex. The humans weren't avoiding war because they were afraid. They had simply learned that war wasn't always the answer. Threx had never considered such a perspective before. His council, a group of hardened warriors who had served alongside him in countless campaigns, was divided. Some dismissed the human broadcast entirely, scoffing at the notion that any species would refuse to fight. "They're afraid," one of the commanders barked, his voice thick with disdain. "They talk of their history because they know they'll be crushed if they try to resist. Let us finish what we came here to do. Wipe them out and move on." Others, however, weren't so sure. One of Threx's closest advisors, a battle-scarred veteran named Grix, voiced a different opinion. "They are not like the others we've conquered," Grix said slowly, his deep-set eyes narrowing in thought. "Most species either fight or flee. But these humans, They confront their own mistakes, their own failures. They learn from them. That takes a different kind of strength. Threx said nothing at first, allowing the room to descend into debate. His war council, so accustomed to straightforward decisions, was now grappling with something far more abstract. What was strength? Was it only about physical dominance and victory in battle, or was there something more? The human's words had unsettled him. Their message hadn't been one of surrender, nor had it been an empty boast. Instead, it had been a clear demonstration that they had survived conflicts beyond the Zarthans' understanding, conflicts not just with other species, but with themselves. That last part lingered in Threx's mind. The Zarthans had never known war within their own kind. Their strength had come from unity, from a singular purpose driven by conquest. But the humans had fought their own, nearly destroyed their own world, and still came out on the other side. Threx, we cannot let them live. They have defied us by refusing our challenge. To allow them to go unpunished would be seen as weakness by the rest of the galaxy. Another council member pressed, breaking through the growing tension in the room. Threx shifted in his seat, his gaze cold and calculating. There was truth in those words. The Zarthans had built their reputation on being the strongest, the most ruthless. Any sign of hesitation or perceived mercy could embolden others. But at the same time, Threx was beginning to see that brute force wasn't the only measure of strength. These humans, with their chaotic and self-destructive history, had shown a kind of resilience that was alien to the Zarthans. Strength is not just about war, Threx finally said, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. Strength is about survival. These humans, for all their flaws, have survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser species. They have fought wars beyond anything we've seen, and yet they still stand. We must consider what that means. The room fell silent. Threx rarely questioned the path of war. His council, seasoned in years of conquest, was unaccustomed to hearing him speak in such terms. They were used to decisive action, to crushing opposition without hesitation. But Threx was not just a warlord, he was a strategist. And what he had seen in the humans was a kind of strength that could not be ignored. What if we are the ones who have been limited? Grix ventured, breaking the silence. We have only ever known one way, war. But the humans, they've learned to change. They've adapted. That is strength too, is it not? The idea was heretical in Zarathian culture, where strength was measured purely by the ability to conquer. But Threx, who had spent his life in the pursuit of power, was beginning to understand that perhaps the humans were offering a different kind of lesson. Perhaps true power lay not just in the destruction of enemies, but in the ability to evolve, to grow, and to avoid destruction in the first place. You think we should turn away from war? One of the commanders sneered, his voice filled with contempt. Threx raised a hand to silence him. I did not say that, he replied. War has made us strong, and it will continue to do so. But strength comes in many forms. The humans have shown us that survival, long-term survival, requires more than just the ability to wage war. It requires the ability to learn from it, to rise above it. He stood, the full weight of his decision beginning to take shape. The Zarthans had never faced a situation like this before. Every species they had encountered had either fallen before them or submitted without question. But the humans were different. They were not refusing war out of fear. They were refusing it because they had transcended the need for it. Threx felt the eyes of his council on him, waiting for his command. He knew that whatever decision he made would ripple throughout the galaxy. To back down would seem weak to some, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the humans had offered something more valuable than a mere battle. They had offered insight. We will not engage them in war, Threx declared, his voice firm and resolute. The council erupted in shock. Some voices rose in anger, others in confusion, but Threx did not waver. We will not engage them, he repeated. Not because we are afraid. Not because they are weak. But because they are strong in ways we are only beginning to understand. He turned to Grix, his most trusted advisor. We will watch them. We will learn from them. And perhaps, in time, we will become stronger for it. With that, the decision was made. The Zarathian fleet would not attack. The humans, with their history lesson, had done something no other species had ever achieved. They had given the Zarathians pause. They had shown them a path not just of conquest, but of survival, and in doing so, they had earned their place in the galaxy not as warriors, but as survivors. Threx, for the first time in his long career as warlord, felt a shift within himself. The humans had challenged everything he thought he knew about power and strength. And though he had come seeking war, he was leaving with something far more valuable, a new understanding of what it meant to endure. The Zarathian fleet, once poised to obliterate Earth, now hovered in a silent, uneasy ceasefire. On Earth, humanity waited, bracing for an attack that never came. The skies remained clear, and the war machines of the galaxy's most powerful species stood still. It was a tension unlike anything the world had known before. Every second felt like an eternity, each moment filled with the weight of uncertainty. Back on the Zarathian command ship, Warlord Threx's decision reverberated through his ranks. His command not to engage in war with the humans had left his forces stunned. Some saw it as a betrayal of their culture, a deviation from the path of conquest that had defined them for millennia. But Threx stood by his choice. He had seen something in humanity that he hadn't expected, a strength that transcended battlefields and weapons. It wasn't about dominance or destruction, it was about survival, about enduring the worst and continuing to exist. Back on Earth, the leaders of humanity cautiously began to process what had happened. The Zarathians were retreating. Their demand for war had been met with a history lesson, and in return, they had backed down. For the first time in history, humanity had faced an unstoppable force and had survived without firing a shot. The shock of it all slowly gave way to a realization: they had won, but not in any way they had anticipated. The aftermath of Threx's decision rippled through both societies. On Earth, celebrations were subdued. There was relief, of course, but also reflection. The humans had looked into their own history and offered it as a lesson to an alien force, hoping that it would be enough. And it had been. But the lesson wasn't just for the Zarathians. In revisiting their past conflicts, humanity had also reminded itself of the cost of war, of the devastation that comes with unchecked power. The near miss with annihilation had rekindled a sense of responsibility, an understanding that their survival wasn't just luck but a result of the hard-earned wisdom passed down through generations. For the Zarathians, the reaction was far more complex. Threx's war council, divided in their opinions, struggled to come to terms with the warlord's decision. Many warriors bred for combat found themselves questioning their purpose. If war was not the only measure of strength, then what were they fighting for? Threx himself faced the weight of his choice every day, knowing that many of his people viewed it as a sign of weakness. But deep down, Threx knew that his decision was not one of cowardice, it was one of evolution. His people needed to grow, to see that strength wasn't just about conquering worlds but about learning from them. The Zarathian Empire, long feared throughout the galaxy, now stood at a crossroads. Threx's decision had set in motion a quiet revolution within his ranks. Some of his closest advisors began to adopt a new way of thinking, influenced by the humans' example. Perhaps there was more to strength than victory in battle. Perhaps, in learning from the mistakes of others, they could find a path that would allow them to thrive in ways they had never imagined. Still, resistance to this change was fierce. Many Zarathians clung to their traditions, seeing any deviation from their warlike ways as an affront to their heritage. Threx had expected this. He knew that changing a culture so deeply rooted in conquest would not happen overnight. But he had planted the seed. And now, it was up to his people to decide how they would grow. As for Earth, the world moved forward, but with a new understanding of its place in the galaxy. The encounter with the Zarathians had shown humanity that they were no longer alone, and that the universe was filled with civilizations far older and more powerful than their own. But it had also shown that power was not everything. They had faced the greatest force in the galaxy and had survived not by matching it with violence, but by offering wisdom. It was a lesson in itself, that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in knowing when not to fight. In the weeks that followed the retreat of the Zarathian fleet, Earth's leaders reached out across the stars, cautiously opening channels of communication with other species. They knew that while they had survived this encounter, the galaxy was vast, and there would be more challenges to come. But now, humanity had something it hadn't had before: the knowledge that their history, their resilience, was their greatest weapon. They had faced the brink of destruction and emerged stronger, not through force, but through understanding. As the Zarathians faded into the distant reaches of space, Threx reflected on the lesson the humans had imparted. For so long, his people had believed that war was the only path to greatness. But now, he saw that there was another way. The humans had endured wars that dwarfed anything the Zarathians had ever imagined, and yet they had chosen peace. That was their strength, the ability to rise above their own destructive tendencies and build something better. Threx wasn't sure what the future held for his people. He knew that change would be slow and that many would resist the new ideas taking root in their society. But he also knew that the humans had shown them a different path, one that could lead to something greater than conquest. The lesson had been given, and now it was up to the Zarathians to decide whether they would follow it. On Earth, life returned to something resembling normalcy, though the memory of the Zarathian threat lingered. There was a newfound sense of unity among humanity, a recognition that their survival had come not from their differences, but from their shared history and the lessons they had learned from it. And while the world continued to face its own challenges, there was a quiet confidence that, whatever came next, humanity would endure. For Threx, the decision to walk away from war had not been easy, but it had been the right one. As his fleet moved farther from Earth, he couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted, not just within his people, but within himself. The humans had taught him that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about knowing when to fight and when to choose another path. And as the Zarathian fleet disappeared into the stars, Warlord Threx, for the first time, felt something unexpected, a sense of hope for the future.